On this day, the 17th of December, 1718, Britain declares war on Spain. Now, it's not unusual for Britain to be declaring war on Spain in that era, but what is unusual is that Britain was in alliance with France against Spain. Between, I want to say the late 17th century up until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, so a good period, like 250 years, we'll say, Britain was almost always at war with France, or it was in standoff against France, or was in competition against France. It was never an ally with France against anyone. However, for a brief period at the beginning of the 18th century, Britain and France were actually allies. Now, this came after the War of the Spanish Succession. So you see who should or would succeed to the Spanish throne. The Habsburgs in Spain were gone. They had incested themselves out of the genealogical tree. So the Bourbons, the French royal family, were the senior line to the throne. The Habsburgs wanted Spain back, though. They wanted that throne. They wanted to keep it. So they had someone that they wanted to take that throne. France said, no, we want these guys. Britain was like, hell no, none of you will have that. And there was a massive war. And it was a world war, basically. And it went on for a good while. That was the war in which Britain took Gibraltar. And the Treaty of Utrecht gave Britain Gibraltar as well as Minorca. And it also banned the Spanish Bourbons from taking the French throne, and it banned the French Bourbons from taking the Spanish throne. Because Spain and France together would be too powerful. Austria and Spain together would also be too powerful. So it was in no one's interests that two powerful countries would be ruled by one family. So that was the background. And after this war, Philip V of Spain, he was the Bourbon that was he was the Duke of Anjou, and he was put on the throne, but he didn't like the idea of renouncing his claim on the French throne, because the French throne at this point was the most glorious throne in all of Western Europe, well, all of the world probably one of the wealthiest and most powerful monarchies in the world. So he kind of thought, well, maybe I could go back on that. It was just a legal thing I signed at Utrecht and agreed to. Maybe it doesn't, actually mean anything. So he was thinking about this. He was also thinking that he wanted the lands that Spain had lost, the Spanish Netherlands, which had become the Austrian Netherlands, Sardinia, Sicily, parts of Italy. He wanted them back. And Spain recovered quite quickly from the War of the Spanish Succession. And so he decided he was going to do something about this. In 1717, Spain took Sardinia. Apparently no one cared. The Duke of Savoy, that was, he was in charge, well, no, the Austrians were in charge of it at that time. Later on, the Duke of Savoy would take it, then make himself the King of Sardinia. But no one declared war, or fought him, or fought the Spanish. And I've been to Sardinia, and it's quite nice. And it's quite big as well. It's a nice big island, and if someone took that from me, I don't think I'd be very happy. But they got away with it. And you know what happens when someone gets away with something. So in July of 1718, next year, so a couple of months later, they landed 30,000 troops on Sicily. Now this wasn't a pushover, they had to fight, but fight they did, and they started taking towns, Palermo, Messina, and various other cities. They were conquering Sicily. Now, on the 2nd of August of that very same year, the Quadruple Alliance came into being. Britain and France had already made an alliance back in 1716. The whole point of this was to enforce the Utrecht Treaty. And so they were on side to make sure that everyone sticks to their lane. The next year in 1717, it became a triple alliance when the Dutch joined. They were concerned because they didn't want the Spanish back on their doorstep. Spanish and the Dutch not having exactly a great history. And also in June of 1718, because of what was happening in Sicily, the Royal Navy then sailed a fleet into the Western Mediterranean as a warning to the Spanish not to get too uppity. Now, so, as I said, on the 2nd of August, Austria joins Britain, France, and the Netherlands and then it becomes the Quadruple Alliance, because the Austrians had been a bit distracted because they'd been fighting the Turks. So they didn't really have time to be defending Sardinia or going to war against Spain. So after that war concluded, they then turned to the west, signed the alliance, and this is when the war starts. Now, one of the reasons France joined this alliance, well, actually, one of the reasons why they declared war, not so much alliance, they were already in the alliance, is because there had been an attempted, maybe not attempted, there was a cardinal, Spanish cardinal or Italian cardinal, I think is what he was. He tried to maneuver the Duc d'Orléans out of power. And the Duc d'Orléans was the regent at the time, because the king, Louis XV, who was Louis XVI's, I think, maybe great-grandfather, he ruled for like 60 years, or 55 years or something. So he ruled for a long time. He was 5 years old, so you can't have a 5-year-old running things. So there's the Cardinal Alberoni, so that sounds a bit Italian. And he was attempting to make Philip V the regent of France, which would have meant, basically, that Utrecht would have been overturned. That Spain would have been in control of the most powerful empire in the world. And yes, the Duc d'Orléans was having nothing to do with this. So Alberoni was expelled from France, and France then declared war on Spain because they saw this as a Spanish plot to seize control of France and French power. Now, as the Spanish are conquering Italy, the French and the British together, again this is a very strange thing at this point in history, French and the British together invade the Basque part of Spain. They capture San Sebastian and they march across country into parts of northern Catalonia. They're welcomed by some of the locals and the bigwigs, and they call for France to annex the areas. Spain is not happy with this, so they retaliate by sending a force to Brittany to try to raise a rebellion against the Duc d'Orléans. They get there and they find that the Bretons they kind of look at them and go, nah, they're not interested, so they leave because no one's interested in helping them. They also help the Jacobite invasion of Scotland, or they try to. So what happens, they're going to send a fleet from Spain, but the fleet was dispersed by a storm near Galicia. It never reached Britain. And so there was about 300 Spaniards with a couple of Jacobites. They land in Scotland. There's some small skirmishes, but it kind of fizzles out, so it's a bit disappointing. It's not as good as the other Jacobite rebellions. Not as impressive. And so, but the British are not impressed with this either. So they decide to retaliate, and they land troops at Vigo, which is in Galicia. They capture the town, and they march inland, which alarms the Spanish. And they're like, oh my god, we've got fronts all over the place now. And at the very same time, the Austrians have now landed in Sicily and are fighting the Spanish in Sicily. And they're starting to beat the Spanish. The British fleet is now surrounding Sicily. They've been cut off from home. There really isn't much hope. They're going to lose Sicily, which is one of the main aims of this. So, also, conflict took place in the New World. Now, again, this is a very unusual event. Pensacola, which was in Spanish Florida, there was an army, a Spanish army that was gathering in Pensacola and was going to march on the Carolinas. And they were stopped because the French battled them and took Pensacola. So the French saved the British colonies of North and South Carolina from Spanish invasion, which has got to be the only time in all of history when that happened. At the same time, the Spanish in Cuba sent a force to Nassau in the Bahamas, which was British, and they were going to take that, and they ended up sacking the place, and then they had to leave because the locals got a militia together and chased them out. So there were battles going on all over the place, and it was back and forth. The Spanish were doing something, and the Brits or the French would come back to them, or the Austrians would kick their butts, or they'd go and do this, and someone else would come and do that. Back and forth. So it was quite an interesting war, and one of which I didn't even know existed until quite recently. Now, Philip V, seeing the mess that he had been brought into, because he had no allies, he had 4 countries against him, 4 powerful countries, and plus Savoy as well. Savoy was also fighting against him. So he had France with its massive army and quite large navy, Austria with its massive army, he had the Dutch with their money and their ships, and the British with their army and navy as well. You can't win when everyone is against you. So he dismissed Alberoni. So that was the guy who was trying to take over France earlier on. And he decided to make peace. And that was in 1720. So it was quite a quick war by that time as well. It was only about 2 years. So it wasn't too bad. So he had to go back to the Treaty of Utrecht. He had to accept that was going to be enforced. He did manage to get his 3rd sons to be the heir of Parma and Piacenza, and that was for his mistress. Which, okay, Parma's nice as well. Piacenza, lovely. But they're kind of small and they're kind of out of the way, and Spain can't really protect them. They're right next to Austria. And he also swapped, Spain and Savoy swapped Sicily and Sardinia. So Spain got Sicily, Savoy got Sardinia, and then Savoy became known as Sardinia. And that was about it. So it was a bit of a useless war for Spain. Didn't really do them much good, except united the entire world against them. However, the alliance, this quadruple alliance, wasn't going to last very long. 1731 is when Spain and France became friends again. And you know what happens after 1731. We have almost non-stop war between Britain and Spain on one side, or Spain and France on one side, and Britain on the other. 7 Years' War, American War of Independence, Revolutionary Wars, Napoleonic Wars. So yeah, it's going to be almost a century after this. But for a brief moment, Britain and France were allies. So, on this day, 17th of December, 1718, Britain declares war on Spain. Come back for more tomorrow if you like these videos. Comment, like, and subscribe.